right, Imagine we are ready to start.
Groovy, groovy. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another installment of the Tennessee Urban Forestry Council's webinar series. Happy February. I hope it's not as cold and snowy as it is here in Tennessee, but I know Paul out in Michigan is experiencing some of that right now. So, hello, welcome, welcome. Today we have Paul joining us. I'm going to give a quick synopsis on a little bit about Paul's background, and then we'll hop over to housekeeping and we'll get right into the webinar today. So please join me in welcoming Paul Hickman, a pioneer leading the urban wood industry, sustainable design, and circular economy solutions. Paul has over 30 years of experience in green building and materials innovation. Paul has played a key role in transforming urban wood into a high-value resource that drives local economic development, job creation, and sustainability. He co-founded the Urban Wood Project in response to the emerald ash borer infestation and has since expanded his reach nationwide. As the founder and CEO of Urban Ashes, Paul has developed groundbreaking strategies for reclaiming and repurposing fallen urban trees, creating innovative products, and contributing to the circular urban wood trichotomy model. His leadership extends to helping shape sustainable material standards, advocating for urban forestry recovery, and fostering community-based economic empowerment. Through his efforts, Paul has been a lasting impact or has made a lasting impact on the circular economy and continues to shape the future of sustainable urban wood utilization today. So today's webinar, Paul is going to talk about proven strategies for leveraging urban wood. He's going to walk us through real world solutions for using urban wood to drive local economic growth, job creation, and sustainability, all while reducing disposal costs and carbon emissions. He's going to showcase some case studies. He's going to talk about his industry experience. And really, more than that, from what I kind of gleaned through our conversation pre-talk today, Paul really wants to create an environment where we can have a lot of questions flowing in and have an open discussion about how this can be applicable for you in real world environments. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this over to Katie to give us some housekeeping on CEUs, and then we will get started.
Thank you, Imagine. Let me share my screen. Okay. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Katie Donaldson with the UT School of Natural Resources, and I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping notes for y'all. If you are joining this webinar to receive ISA CEUs or SAF CFEs, please make sure you are registered. And if you are not a TUFC member or just a general attendee, please pay the $10 fee for that registration. And if you have a moment, or when you have a moment, please make sure that your full name is showing in order to get credit, those ISA CEU and SAF CFE credits. Please use the name that you registered with. This just makes it easier for us to go through all the data and ensure that you receive those credits after the webinar. At the end, we will also show a QR code that you can scan. That's just an extra step to show that you've been on the webinar the entire time so that you get those credits. And I'll also throw a link in the chat for that at the very end. Also, if you have any questions that you want to ask during the presentation, please submit those in the chat and we will get to those. And if we don't answer those immediately, like I said, we will have a Q&A portion at the end of the webinar. I believe those are all the housekeeping notes I have. So Imagine I'll send it back to you unless you can think of anything I missed.
No, not at all. Let's go ahead. Let's let Paul take
on. You were breaking up there, Imagine. Did you say go ahead?
Oh, so sorry. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay.
Stop sharing. There we go.
Let me bring up mine. Okay, hopefully everybody can see our logo here. As Imagine gave you more information about me than you probably ever want to hear. But the short of it is I've been working with urban wood utilization for a long time, since the mid to late 90s. Pretty much in every aspect, from design to manufacturing to working with mills to now doing a lot of work with municipalities, as well as doing product development. So what I want to go through today is kind of talk about a little bit of high level stuff, but want to kind of dig into more of the meat and potatoes of what's going on out there, what are the real numbers, and how we can potentially, help municipalities and if all the various stakeholders that we need throughout the process for utilization to get involved in, what your role is and what you can do to, help divert some of this, the vast volumes of urban wood that are available every year that unfortunately tend to get chipped or burned. So in starting with that, I always want to start with what the definition of urban wood. Unfortunately, it's a term that's been around a long time and it is a bit of a misnomer. And my sort of shortened version of it is any wood that came from any tree that has come down for any reason other than its wood value. It can come from urban, suburban, or rural locations. So the urban that's where the misnomer comes in. And this could be storm damaged trees, blight stricken trees, street trees, yard trees, but also orchard trees and other trees that are out in more of a rural or suburban environment. It doesn't have to be from an urban environment. So hopefully everybody understands these are trees that have come down recently. We're not talking about today. We're not going to be talking about deconstructed wood. So this is sort of the basic high level stuff, and most of you probably already know this, but I do like to run through it real quick for those who don't necessarily have the full background on what our trees do. But generally speaking, sort of second grade level science here that trees spend their entire life capturing CO2 and converting that to carbon. And once a tree comes down and starts to decay in various forms, depending on what situation is for that tree, it's going to release that CO2 or release that carbon back into the atmosphere as CO2 again. And in some cases, a whole lot quicker when it comes into, if you're mulching it and expediting the decay process. And then if it's burned as firewood or biofuel, it's releasing that a whole lot quicker as well. And so just a real simple sort of explanation of what happens to our trees. When it's out in a forested situation, it's still releasing that carbon back into the atmosphere, but it's also doing a whole lot of other beneficial elements back into as a habitat snag and those things. But when we are talking about urban trees in general, they often can't be left in that form. So they need to be removed for safety reasons and lots of other reasons. Now, to look at the general volume that we have, oh, I just lost my screen. Where did my screen, where did my screen go? Let me stop sharing and reshare. Okay, now it's back. That's weird. It disappeared on me. Sort of looking at the overall potentials for the country, it's roughly generally considered in the industry 7 to 8 billion board feet is available as high quality furniture grade lumber, and that equates to about 46 million metric tons. And generally speaking, hardwoods are about 50% carbon by dry weight. And so that equates to, looking at that, you're looking at about 3.8 million metric tons of sequestered carbon, or that could be potentially continue to be sequestered. And that's released through the decay. Most of it is being chipped. And then as that's released, that's releasing roughly 14 million metric tons of CO2. Now, these numbers, and we've recently, Urban Ashes has recently scaled our numbers down to take into consideration the percentage of material that's still going to be lost in processing. So it's more realistic. So it's not, really extreme numbers that don't really relate to what the end result is. So those of you who have seen numbers before, you may realize that these are actually a little bit lower because we are now taking into consideration the material that gets lost in the processing of the material, for end products. We definitely still would lose product or wood that way. And ultimately, this one in the orange here, I think, is really important because it's very relevant to the trees that came down. And if we are able to just capture roughly about 40% of those trees. And even after the loss of those, of all the, the drops and the sawdust through processing, that would be the equivalent of planting about 93 million trees and growing them for 10 years. So what I'm talking about there is only on the carbon and CO2 side. It is not all the other benefits that trees provide. And generally the reason is the trees that are coming down are, big trees, and the ones that are getting planted are small caliber trees. So it takes a long time for those newly planted trees to catch up. But if we continue to capture that carbon and keep it sequestered, it still retains those benefits of the carbon and CO2. So that's a big number that I always find, very relevant, because we always think about how important planting trees are, and this is a direct correlation to that. And you can look at it as when we talk to cities, and you'll see here in a minute that that number is going to come up again. Let's go in here. So in comparison, on the urban wood industry, so the world's largest unproven direct air capture plant. So if those of you may know about DAC or direct air capture, it is definitely one of the hot topics on how to capture carbon and CO2 out of the atmosphere and sequester it. The largest facility is being built in Texas as we speak, to the tune of about $1 billion. And it's projected to remove about 500,000 metric tons of CO2 a year, which is excellent. We need to have all hands on deck, so to speak. But to compare that to the urban wood industry capacity, that's only about 3.6% of what those numbers that we looked at before. And so getting our priorities focused on, I don't even consider this low-hanging fruit. This is the fruit that's on the ground, and we got to get it up before it rots. It's that easy to access. The unfortunate thing is it's not the big shiny object that direct air capture is, but really having this hard data and being able to present it to the folks that can help us implement that is very critical. Now, looking at and I think this was a pre-question that was asked specifically about data. What cities can or what data can cities start to collect to see how much they're losing to the landfill. So we always perform a baseline life cycle assessment, or an LCA. And this is an example of Ann Arbor as one of the case studies we'll showcase here. And this is some of that data. Ideally, in the case of Ann Arbor, they're planting 1,000 trees a year. When they're hitting their target, that's their goal of hitting 1,000 trees a year for planting. They have roughly about 51,000 trees under their care. And that equates to about 75,000 metric tons of CO2 stored within their canopy. They lose on average about 600 trees a year. And that equates to, based off of the data that we pulled, the size of the trees, the types of trees, that's about 1,100 metric tons of CO2 gets removed from their storage stock annually. Now, about 23, excuse me, all the trees that are greater than 23 inches end up in a biomass pile. Every city's different in how they process this. Ann Arbor cannot chip or grind anything larger than 23 inches. So they lose about 150 trees that end up into that pile every year. And you'll see that that's because they are the larger trees, even though it's a smaller number of trees, that's about 2/3 of the volume that they lose of CO2 every year. And then the ones under 23 inch that end up in the chipper is about 370 metric tons of CO2 that gets released pretty quickly once it's chipped. They do have programs, and most cities do, where the chips go into a mulch program, go into composting programs, which is all great. But I would argue that pretty much every single city out there has more chips than they're ever going to use. Jumping back to the biomass pile, they have, depending on the total volume of trees, every 2 to 4 years, they have a contractor come in that they pay a substantial amount of money to grind up and just make that go away. And that's pretty common with most cities. So what we really want to do is focus on this sort of end of life section here. What happens to the trees once they're removed? This front end stays the same with the city. It doesn't change. That's just sort of the life cycle of their trees. And then what we can showcase by implementing a high level wood recovery program, that upwards of 64% of that wood can be diverted into log sorting yard and then ultimately made available to local mills. That's a very big part of our process, is to be hyper focused on providing this material back to local mills. I have a very strong, long belief that urban wood industry is a very hyper local industry, and keeping that wood local for local manufacturing and processing, we think is absolutely the best way to get this wood out and utilized. Now, in this top portion, we also is kind of another part of what Urban Ashes works on. We're not going to touch on a whole lot, but in developing new products and new markets for urban wood utilization, looking at some high level uses for composites and things like that, where that can tap into the real low level quality woods that wouldn't typically be mill grade, keeping those still out of the chipper and utilized into new products as well. Ultimately, where you're down to only about 11% getting into the chipper. So what that ends up looking at is 64 to 89% of the volume that they were losing before of those 600 trees is kept into the system, and that equates to about 700 metric tons of carbon continuing to be sequestered. So definitely a major impact. And I want to talk about the history of urban wood recovery programs in the country. These are 4 of the largest in the country that have been active for over 10 years and have a really strong proven record. So this is not anything brand new. The urban wood industry has been around for decades. Cities have been doing this for a while, except it's not common practice across the country. It is definitely something that is happening more recently. Minneapolis's program is started in the early 2000s, as did Milwaukee's. Both of those are in response to the emerald ash borer. And all 4 of these programs are different in how they operate. The municipalities are all a little different. Baltimore is the only one that is doing it entirely in-house. It is entirely municipally run, where they capture their trees, they process the trees, they do the milling, they convert it to lumber. They're even selling lumber, and I believe they're making products definitely back for the city. I'm not sure if they're making products now for the public, but they do sell both the logs and lumber back to the public. That is the only municipally run one. Fort Collins came out of a program that was actually originally the Kendra Boot, who is the city forester there, was a grad student at the university there as well, and wrote the program and ultimately became the city forester, and has been running this program for, I think, about 15 years, 12 years. And they are at net zero right now, so they don't have any waste. That does include some firewood and some chips, but they make sure that everything that they have coming down gets processed to its highest and best use. So they're doing a really good job. Now, this is kind of a list of cities that we have been working with or are currently working with. The top 6 are all cities that have been through. Oh, Bellingham's on there twice. That shouldn't be Bellingham twice. Who am I missing there? Got Bellingham twice. There's another city. I'm insulting one of our cities. I'm sorry. I can't remember who it is. The top, anyways, we've had 6 cities go through the first 2 phases of our program. Currently working with 3 cities have gone through phase 1, and Lansing is actively going through phase 2. Phase 3 is actually implementation. And Ann Arbor is the only city so far that we have actually implemented a program in the last year. So this is all relatively new for us. And the ones that you saw for those 4 cities earlier that have been doing this a long time, these all kind of came up on their own locally. They were not part of a national organization or national entity helping them. It was done sort of the old-fashioned way, bootstraps, let's figure it out the hard way. But the advantage now is there's a lot more folks that have actually done this, so we can implement that and help them implement that. Looking at the list of folks that are here today, it looked like we have a pretty good cross section of these are all the stakeholders that we're looking at. And it looks like we've got a good section of these, and I really want to, every one of these is very important. And I'm gonna, when we get into sort of the engagement portion of this talk, I really would like everybody to speak up and want to talk about what your role is in this area and how you can help facilitate this. Even if you look, it's like, hey, I'm just a, an end user or consumer, though I don't know that we have, that specifically today, but maybe I'm an architect. How do I play a role in this? I would argue the specifiers have maybe the biggest role in this, where they really drive the industry. If there's generate demand on their end, everybody behind them, from the manufacturers to the sawmills to the arborists, the municipalities, will figure out how to get the wood to them. So jumping into the challenges, and this is where I would like to open it up to everybody. If you are, it looks like there were, I don't know, 20% or so of the folks here are working with municipalities, are in as a municipal employee, whether they're in the forestry department or other related areas. I'd like to ask this first question on the top, what are the biggest obstacles your city or organization faces in implementing high-level urban wood utilization? So I'm going to make the assumption that this is something that your municipality is interested in, and you are gathering information. What kind of obstacles are you seeing and the biggest challenges? And I'd like to throw that out there to, some of you municipal folks. Or I saw there's also a large number of private arborists that may be working with municipalities. And so that kind of goes out to both. And any other organization that might be working with a municipality, I'd love to hear what you have to say and see if we can kind of help address some of those obstacles right now. So can we open it up here?
I think Katie might be looking into that right now.
Okay.
People are more than welcome to start adding their comments into the chat. I don't know if we can get audio going, Kevin or Katie. Do you have any input on that?
Or if you just want to throw it up in the Q&A or in the chat section.
So there was a comment from Judson Wilford, and it was, I'm concerned that monetizing urban wood waste will encourage over harvesting, especially in the light of the equipment build up by tree services after years of storms coupled with homeowner fears in a political climate that strongly opposes urban forestry controls. How would you respond to this?
Yeah, it comes up, and this is going way back in our early involvement here in Ann Arbor, which is a city that absolutely loves their trees. So that concern comes up right away. And that happens with a lot of cities. So we always want to be very, very clear that it's always trees first, and then the wood and or anything that happens to it after that, that trees need to live as long as absolutely possible, and ensure that we are not harvesting trees. And in the case, it does not impact in our process when we work with cities. It does not impact their removal process whatsoever. It's a matter of what were they already doing and when those are coming down. And we can show a big part of that also is we track everything and we identify why this tree had to come down and that it's got to have a legitimate reason, whether that was due to a blight-stricken tree, was it storm damage, was it and we actually do a lot of work with public schools, and in new construction is probably the biggest gray area. In the area, we want to be the most clear about why this tree had to come down, and we want to help salvage as many trees. When I say salvage, not bring them down, save the tree and not bring it down, and even help potentially move the tree to a new location. So that's a big part of what Urban Ashes does also, to really showcase that we want to keep these trees up and alive as long as possible. and we do track why they come down. That is a critical part of our process, and it goes into our database that ultimately becomes part of a certification process, that this is all certified urban wood. Because if you are harvesting a tree for the sake of its wood value, it is no longer considered urban wood. And so we do document that, and Ann Arbor is currently slated to be the first USRW urban wood certified city. So certification and tracking are big ways to help showcase that that's not happening. That was a very long way of answering that question. Hopefully I actually answered it.
We've had several other people comment um, about challenges. One person said apathy and potentially increased costs.
Okay. On the apathy one, I understand that one. And that's where showing hard data. And back, and this is sort of that initial life cycle assessment. When we do that and show them how much they're actually losing, and if they have any kind of well, two things. One, if they have any kind of sustainability goals or carbon goals, we can show them hard data on how much they're really. And going back to the case of Ann Arbor, and I think I didn't mention this, where they're losing 600 trees a year, they're planting 1,000 trees a year, and they thought they were doing pretty well. But by collecting the data that we did, we could show hard data that they have to plant 18,000 trees and grow them for 10 years to make up for year one of loss. That tends to impact a little bit of the apathy side. But apathy is a tough one. And so showing it where it's really impacting their bottom line, whether it's a dollar one or a carbon one. So in the case, one of the other big benefits is diverting a good chunk of this from the biomass pile or the chipper, which is a big cost to a lot of cities. Landfill costs are going up greatly. So our whole model is to actually decrease costs, not increase them. So are there potential increased costs? One of the big things, and you can go see a video, and we're actually doing a follow-up video on this off of our website that talks about this, that we interviewed the municipal staff that brought the trees down using our process or using their business as usual. And they basically said that this is no different than what we would have normally done. There's very minimal change, would not be any additional costs, and we are not seeing any additional costs with the city of Ann Arbor beyond initial training. There is some training on the front end, but it's pretty nominal. It's not anything terribly complicated. There's no additional software. We are tapping directly into city's existing software, so it can come across into our tracking software. So there's no additional cost there. There is additional costs on this front end of identifying what the full benefits are to the city, and being able to showcase this back to whether it's city council or internal staff, that this is viable and here are the cost savings. And that does often take, some reporting and those life cycle assessments. So there's a little bit there, but overall, it's a cost savings is a big part of what we're after here.
Another comment about challenges. Someone said metal in wood. Local mills don't want that risk.
Depends on what kind of local mill we're talking about. If we're talking about high production hardwood and softwood mills that are, doing high production, large volume, you are correct. They will, they're not in generally, though this is changing. There's quite a few mills, particularly up in the Northwest, that are adding bandsaw mills to process, specifically to process urban wood, to deal with the metal in particular. But most mills that deal with urban wood in general, that are running bandsaw mills, know they're gonna deal with metal, and they have various ways of addressing that, from immediately scanning everything to metal removal, to cutting out that section, or to just saying, hey, we're gonna do a rough mill on this. We know it's gonna beat up our blade. That blade on a bandsaw is $30 to $50 compared to the big giant circular saw blades that are thousands and thousands of dollars and much more difficult to change and much more dangerous when you hit metal. The bandsaw blades on most urban mills are inexpensive and easy to switch out. So metal, the mills that are going to deal with urban wood know they're going to run into metal. I would argue concrete's worse because it's harder to scan for and does just as much damage. And folks seem to think that concrete, repairs trees. So it is one of the first things that folks ask about, but almost any urban mill that has done any kind of volume of milling knows how to deal with metal. So it's really not a concern anymore.
And this is a big one I'm sure that a lot of people relate to. This person says we have no experience, no knowledge, and don't know where to start.
Well, you started by being at this webinar. So you found a good starting spot here. There are, the urban wood industry is out there. And depending on where you're located, we're happy to help and get you connected or, work with you depending on what city you are. That this is exactly what we do, is bring that knowledge. As a manufacturer, prior, we saw the impact we could have as a manufacturer, but ultimately the biggest impact we can have is helping share that knowledge or providing that knowledge to cities that don't have that knowledge. There are a few other entities out there that do work specifically with municipalities, but be happy to talk to you and address those exact things. And that's why we're here, whether it's us to do it or connect you with some others in the industry that may be closer to you or more relevant to what you're looking for. We're happy to do that. Our end goal is to keep this from the chipper and the landfill and the burn pile, and we want to tap into everything possible to make that happen.
Another challenge, this person says, my biggest struggle is getting administration on board with this plan.
That data is often the data that I talked about in that life cycle and assessment. That baseline life cycle assessment is almost always the key backbreaker, so to speak, the straw that breaks the camel's back. Is once you can show, I remember the very first one we did when we did the baseline analysis and came back and they looking at how many trees they lose every year, how many trees they plant, and then being able to show hard data to them. It's going to take you planting 18 times as much as what you're planning to actually make up for what you lose in year one. That's when they were like, send me that slide. I need that slide. And this was Public Works, folks. This was not the Forestry Department. This was the Public Works Department, which is typically where you'll see, the on the administrative side or the folks out in the field. Most folks in the Forestry Department are out there. They love trees and they want to do anything. They hate to see any tree get chipped. But when it gets into the financial side, or this is the way we have always done it, to be able to show that hard data is harder for them to discount it. And now they have an actual tangible reason to really look at this. So I would argue that just having that baseline data is very critical.
Another challenge, finding a location for processing that will not have negative impact on the community in which it's happening. History of environmental racism should be considered. This person says they are in Memphis.
Yeah, absolutely. Two things. One, and this is in any city, having the manufacturing process. Well, it depends on what we're talking about. If it's a log yard, most cities have a log yard or a compost and chips that are part of the city property in the city, and that's very low level concerns as far as environmental impact, and it's all most of the time is already part of the municipal fabric. Now, once you start introducing milling and post processing, higher level processing, most cities have moved that outside of the city limits. And so bringing that back into the city limits is generally not a good idea. Most of the time, well, I should say most of the time, in every single case that I can think of, all of the major manufacturing, or when I say manufacturing, the processing, the milling is happening out in more rural environments. So looking at the four, with the exception of Baltimore. Baltimore, even though theirs is kind of it's pretty surrounded by it because it is in part of the city, but the other ones that are listed on there from Milwaukee to Minneapolis, um, actually Minneapolis is in the city. Minneapolis is, but it's been a facility, a manufacturing facility from the go. It wasn't a new addition. Milwaukee is outside the city. Fort Collins is combination of a little bit in the city. They do the initial, just the bandsaw milling at the site, and the rest of it goes off site. But all the cities we are working with, the only thing that we're recommending that happens in the city is the log yard itself. And so you're not seeing any additional processing, any additional environmental impact of, um, sawdust or, any of those things happening in the city, and impacting communities that have historically been taken advantage of. And so our focus is to always, we've got that issue here. One of the challenges here in Ann Arbor in particular is that we do not have a mill within about 60 miles that can handle the volume. We are in the process of developing a mill, but it will be absolutely out in a rural environment, where it will not impact a more densely knit community, and more in agricultural, because it's typically qualifies as agricultural zoning. So that is a big concern. And it's always, you want to, wherever you are going, as far as a municipal log yard or any kind of processing, engage with the local community to make sure this is something that they want from the very beginning. And that's what we always do. And we will continue to do that as best we can.
Another challenge, a city can obviously use or sell a public tree, but how should a city deal with privately owned trees that have come down in a big storm? Do cities usually buy them or ask that they be donated in return for the city removing the wood?
Well, back up even to the first part of it. Every city's different on being able to sell their trees. It's I'd say again, kind of on average, most cities, it's bizarre. They can't make a profit from their resources. And so their trees are considered a resource or an asset. They can't make a profit, but they can pay somebody to come in and chip it up and destroy it. So there's this weird, you know, dichotomy going on there. And so we have to figure out a way to work with the city. And our program is very similar to other recycling programs where a percentage of the sales goes back to the city, to help offset their costs. So similar to recycling plastic, metal, and glass, where a percentage of those sales goes back to the city if you have a sort of a curbside recovery program. So that helps deal with the asset issue and how to manage that, and what does it look like on the books for the city, and how does it fit in with their charter or their bylaws. Now, specifically, private trees. Our model in particular, and this is going to vary on whatever potential model you set up, but our particular model, we start with a municipality that has the scalability or the size and the capacity to start absorbing trees from other communities around there, where we can use a log recovery yard for the smaller communities that don't have the capacity. And then we also open it up to private. That's the bigger challenge. When you open it up to private, you're no longer just dealing with one or two sources of logs coming in. It could be dozens or hundreds, probably, depending on the size of the city. So that is a much bigger challenge. And it's going to be a case by case basis, but that is really where the volume is with private trees. And getting that worked out is really going to be a case by case basis. And whoever asked that question, I'd be happy to talk to you more in detail, because I would need a lot more information. as to, what's already going on with the city, what kind of, this is a very big thing. I was just in a webinar yesterday specifically about, disaster recovery, and the volume of trees that come down like in hurricanes or tornadoes and things like that. How do we get this infrastructure in place to be able to absorb those, whether they're municipal or private? It doesn't matter. The trees, the storm's not going to care. So how do we leverage a log recovery yard or this system to be able to absorb all those? And we're growing into that now. This is relatively new, and those are things as we expand and grow. Our whole goal is to be able to absorb all of those trees and have the infrastructure in place when the storm happens, long before the storm happens.
This person says, I am an owner arborist in Nashville, and I have been bummed to put all of the great logs, wood to waste. I don't have the infrastructure to save much of it. How do I start the conversation with the city?
Um, well, yeah, um, so it sounds, I'm trying to figure out exactly so you are looking to get logs to a log recovery yard. I guess the best way to say is to start it out and just to let the city know that you've got this volume, and you probably know of other arborists out there that have this volume. What can we all do to come together and develop a log recovery yard? How can we help facilitate this and make it, our whole goal is to make it as easy as possible for the municipalities, the private arborists, and then the mills, is to manage and navigate all that red tape. So to answer your question, there is putting a little, bug in their ear that probably you and others in the area would really like to see this, and let them know that there are entities out there, whether it's Urban Ashes or other ones that you could potentially talk to help navigate that and navigate all the bureaucracy and the red tape for everybody. That would be the best way to go, would be, my recommendation. And I'm happy to talk to you that, afterwards also.
This is more of a comment than a question, but they said production tree workers are often focused on efficiency. The communication overhead and decision making creates a delay that the production workers don't want to deal with. Also, a lot of production workers lack the discernment to know what would be desirable for mills. The smaller mills I've delivered wood to quickly reach capacity and get overwhelmed with the volume I provided as a production arborist.
Yes. Okay. There's a whole bunch of stuff baked in there. So where we've been doing work, on the production side is with, public schools where there's new construction, well, and private. So, a case study on that, and this is going back a little ways, but we did, consulting and, other work for Ford Motor Company, where they were clearing 13 acres of land for a new factory. And, this person, I'm guessing, does similar work like this. And they reached out to us relatively early on. And when I say they, it was actually Ford's directive, because it goes all the way back to Henry Ford, that they're supposed to, any tree that comes down is supposed to be used to its highest and best use. That goes all the way back to Henry Ford's directives in the beginning. So they directed their contractors to reach out to somebody to help them make sure that viable mill logs made it to local mills. They reached out to us to help coordinate that whole thing, to make sure that we identified the mills that could handle the volume, that could ultimately produce products that went back into that building. And we do very similar stuff with Ann Arbor Public Schools and other school districts that are doing new construction, that we go out. And so the contractor, we've split it up into two ways, that the production, sometimes it'll be this, if it's just one tree removal contractor, we'll tag trees separately that are ones, we'll identify them for them. They're tagged separately, and then they're even given a photograph of, where to cut it on that tree. It does take a little, it's not just, fly through the system or fly through the trees. But it does take a little bit more time, but we're doing the legwork in advance and identifying the mill logs in advance. So the tree removal service does not have to do that. And then making sure, setting up where they're to be staged, how they're to be picked up, what mills they go to, we coordinate all of that. So happy to work with tree removal services. The other way we've also done it is you'll get some production companies or, production tree removals that don't want to deal with mill grade logs. And so we'll tag, let's say there's, 400 trees coming down and 30 of them have been identified as mill grade logs. We'll tag those 30, and then that production company is going to treat those 30 as if they're going to stay standing, and another tree service that is more dedicated to sort of specialty removals would come in and remove those. So I'm trying to accommodate, whether the production company doesn't want to deal with it at all, and then another company could take care of those. We've done that. We've also done it where, we tag the trees, and just when they get to those trees, they treat those trees differently, but they don't have to select it. And then we also deal with, how do they get staged? How do they get tagged? How do they get out to the mills when they're picked up, and all of that processing? We manage all of that for them, so the production company doesn't have to.
Okay. I'm gonna continue asking questions, but I'm also gonna go ahead and share that QR code that I mentioned at the very beginning. And I think, are both screens up? I tried to do both at the same
I
time, but I
wanted
don't.
to get mine up here too. There we go. I should have left ours on here. So if anybody wants to reach out, um, my contact information is here, and then the QR code here will take you to our website. There are some videos there, and obviously a whole lot more information about what we do and our history. But do feel free to reach out to us directly, and happy to help. As I said, our whole goal is to make this as easy as possible for everybody to divert this stuff from being destroyed, because it's often spectacular and there's a whole lot of carbon in there.
Okay, I'm gonna continue asking questions now. The next one, this is this comment actually has multiple questions. Converting waste to lumber is great, but what about biochar? I don't see how it is carbon neutral, much less reductive. Is there nothing better to be done with waste wood? How does it compare with fossil fuels?
Okay, I almost want to see that. Let me look at that question again. It's production tree workers. Let me get down here. Converting waste to lumber is great, but what about biochar? Um, so I've been talking predominantly about lumber, which is, which are, Wilford, or is it Judson Wilford, made the comment about. We look at every possible use. In some cases, a lot of the wood is not, the highest use really is building materials that can go into a building, and then into furniture, then into industrial grade materials, then into biochar, um, whether that's chips and compost also. Now that we've been doing a lot of work with composites, hitting every single one of those as much as possible, and um, starting from the top down, and using as best, to its highest and best use, and working its way down to where every single aspect, cottonwood is a classic one that's hard to find good uses for it. Though it does work well for, at least in Michigan, it gets heavily used as green lumber for pallets. So I'm not 100% sure what you were asking about biochar. I am not. We work with a couple different biochar organizations, and that's a little out of my pay grade, so to speak. I'm always afraid to get into the weeds on biochar because I don't know the chemistry and everything behind it. I'm happy to talk to you offsite or offline and connect you with some of the folks we work with. So I don't want to get too deep into biochar. That's a little out of my realm. Absolutely on Fort Collins. Kendra is great.
If anyone else has any questions, please put them in the chat.
Forestry in Middle Tennessee. Where in Middle Tennessee? Kevin, where's
Yeah, in Nashville.
Oh, in Nashville.
Next week, 26th, from 4 to 6 or 6:30 p.m. At the Ellington Ag Center. The Division of Forestry is hosting a community wood utilization meetup for
Awesome.
folks in the area who want to learn more, get connected with other stakeholders. So TFC will be there, and certainly any of y'all in the area would love to see you there. I think it'll be I think the first of many, hopefully, meetups, and we'll be looking to work with the Division of Forestry and supporting their efforts to continue to build out, the urban wood network and communities throughout the state.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, no, yeah, I'd love to be down there. I don't know if I can get down there, but I would love to, hear how that all goes and who's involved and, get a kind of report back on how things are going in Nashville. Any other questions?
Jason just asked about your contact information because he says the city of Atlanta really needs some help getting started.
The city of Atlanta just got my favorite city forester to take over their natural resources department. So the city of Atlanta is going to be in good hands very shortly. That would be Tiffany Jacobazzi, who was city forester up here in Michigan, and she is now the head of their Department of Natural Resources, which is, I believe, is above, the forestry department. So you will be probably seeing things. Jason, I don't know what your role is. Oh, you'll be working for her. Okay, I see that. You're not going to find a better champion for urban wood utilization out there. So I'm looking forward to seeing some things happening in Atlanta. That's a big beast and an exciting one to tackle, and I'm looking forward to it. Tiffany's great.
Another question just came in. What are some good resources for learning about processing arborist wood waste into different size chips?
Again, that's a little out of my pay grade. I could find out that information, but I don't have direct information on that. I'm happy to, Chris, if you want to shoot me a text at the phone number there or an email, I'm happy to find some resources or information on that for you. I can't answer that question. Though I do want to go back to one of the folks that mentioned about being a private arborist in Nashville area and wasting so much wood. How can they work with the city? I will say that the most natural and most common transition or way we are seeing urban mills starting are from an arborist, from folks like you that hate to see all this stuff get destroyed, will often include start milling as part of their services. So that's something we're also happy to help with. We have some business models on how to do that and some folks to connect you with. So that is a very natural transition, or not necessarily transition, I would say added value to your services. But a very high percentage of the urban mills out there, especially even the ones that are large urban mills, they started out as arborists. and continue to be in many cases. So they're offering both services. So, that's a great way to get local mills, especially if you're an arborist and you happen to be, you've already got somewhat of a log yard, you're dealing with things. Do you have more space? Can you access more space? You're the one cutting the logs, obviously. And you'll see mills going the other direction. One of the largest ones in the country is Urban Lumber Company out of Springfield, Oregon. 2 years ago, he bought a big commercial arborist company, and now they're providing a lot of their own logs. So there's a good symbiosis there. I'd be happy to reach out to Tennessee Tech University. And do you have contact information on somebody who I should speak to there? Oh, okay. Well, I can dig into that. I'll see what I can find. And I'm assuming you are in the same community with Tennessee Tech University in Cookeville or the Cookeville area. And I may want to lean. It's always great to have a local champion. So instead of just having some outsider knock on the door, it's always good to have a local at least with us, or maybe I can help you make the initial contact and navigate that for you, and or with you. We can figure that out.
I imagine your email inbox post call today is going to be very, very full.
That's okay. That's why we're here. We love what we do, and like I said, it's all about diverting as much of this from the chipper as possible. And there's a lot of it, and I'm excited to see this many people interested in helping and being part of it. We've been pushing the log up the hill for a long time. Okay. Understood. What you say, Ann, but well, I'm happy to dig into that and see what I can find. And if you go ahead and reach out to me, so at least I can keep you in the loop as to how things are going, and you can be involved as much as you want or as little as you want.
And then it sounds like there's a lot of Tennessee folks, or Southeastern folks that may want to meet you. Just throwing this out there. I don't know if you already are going, but we've got the TUFC conference this fall in potentially November. Dates haven't been announced yet, though.
Yep.
And then there's the ISA Southern Conference in Memphis this year in the second week of April, the 7th through 11th.
Yep.
Just throwing that out there. I don't know if you have any interest in going. But I'm sure a lot of these individuals in the call today might be there and would love to meet you. So just food for thought, throwing it out there.
Absolutely.
If you have any interest.
I was personally down at the conference in Nashville this past fall, and definitely looking at Memphis and Nashville again this year. So I will be traveling a lot this year around the country, and like I said, Atlanta is work we're doing now, and multiple cities already in contact in Tennessee, and then other areas in the South as well. So happy to talk to everybody. Actually just got connected with Alexandria, Louisiana. I didn't know there was an Alexandria, Louisiana.
All right. Well, it looks like we answered all of our questions and comments, and it's almost 1 o'clock. So imagine you just want to wrap it up. I can't hear you. I think we lost your volume.
Oh no, can you hear me now?
Yes, now I can.
Oh,
Sorry
somebody's
about
on
that.
mute now.
Oh, me?
Katie, you went on mute.
Oh, I think she did that on purpose. So I'll just close it out. Thank you. That's all I was saying.
Now
There's a
Imagine's
very
on mute.
Are you really?
I'm not hearing anybody.
What? Hello?
Imagine,
Well,
I can hear you.
I can hear Imagine.
Okay. It's like, oh no. Thank you is all I'm going to say. It's very obvious that there's a very clear need and interest in the initiatives that you've been, rolling out for the last 30 years. I'm sure everybody here is excited to meet you in person. Thank you everyone very much for joining us today in this discussion. And don't forget to get those CEUs signed up and in. If you have any issues, reach out to Katie and Kevin. Their contact information is attached with the webinar emails. And I believe in the chat comments, Kevin's email is in there. So that's all I've got. Thank you guys. Thank you, Paul. And that's it for me.